Our next speaker is the very distinguished president of the New Israel Fund. She's a former member of the Knesset. She is one of the founders of Israel Women's Network. She is an outspoken human rights advocate and has degrees from Columbia University and Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Naomi, Chazan.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I literally came to be with you this morning. I was here yesterday evening, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it too because I have to teach my students in Tel Aviv tomorrow afternoon. I was dearly hoping that you would be eating, because as a former deputy speaker of the Knesset, I found that when people are munching, they can't answer you back. It's the only time they're really silent. So if you want to nibble on something, please do feel free to do so. I see here Christians and Jews and some Muslims and no Chinese. And therefore, I may have made a mistake, I see one. But there is a Chinese saying, and I think you know it well, it's more a curse than a saying, that you should live in interesting times. And these are probably the most interesting times in the Arab-Israel conflict for years. Simultaneously, two things are taking place, and I want to frame the issue and proceed from there. There is a sense, and it is electric, that things are moving along at a tremendously fast pace. There is an urgency in the air. I think you all sense it. The Arab-Israel conflict is reaching its boiling point and is awaiting resolution. At the same time, we have all heard so many words in the past few days, and my hunch is that we will hear more tomorrow in the next few days, that it's all very confusing. People don't know what to think. They are inordinately concerned that there may be a backpedaling when things are moving forward. And therefore, it obliges us to ask several questions. Number one, what is our vision? And I will talk about an Israeli vision, but I think it is a vision that is shared by peace-loving people. What are the dynamics at work today? What are the options? And the most important question, what should we do about it? Because underlying the discussions today and yesterday evening is the question of what should we do? How can we move forward? And I will argue very strongly and like to leave you with the thought that this is the most significant moment in the history of Arab-Israeli relations since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. We have to understand what a momentous crossroads we are actually at today. Really. And during this period, and it is not going to be a long period, we have to keep our eyes and our minds and our actions very focused on the decent and just outcome that will stabilize the region and allow us all to live in peace. And that means sometimes harnessing oneself in, controlling one's emotions, and allowing our minds to be much more creative than they have been to date. So what is the vision? And I can talk about an Israeli vision. Some people will claim that my vision is not the vision of the majority of the people of the state of Israel, and I will tell you that my vision is shared by 2/3 of the citizens of the state of Israel. Because my vision is a value-based vision, which, by the way, has its roots in Israel's Declaration of Independence. And it talks about liberty and justice and peace in one sentence. They are linked, these values, to equality and tolerance for the other on the basis of the vision of the prophets of Israel. In other words, universal values embedded in the scriptures as the guiding values of what Israel was based on, founded on, and must abide by in order to survive. Any vision today, I propose to you, has to be a value-driven vision. If it's not a value-driven vision, it will disappear. And that means that many of us, for years, have advocated a two-state solution for two primary reasons. First of all, because it is a moral solution for the Palestinian people. And secondly, because it is in Israel's uppermost interest to liberate itself from occupation of another people against its will. It's the only way Israel is going to be free. When a convergence of goals, the two-state solution is the only way to deal with the fact that two peoples live on the land, and each one of these people has the right to self-determination, and without the self-determination of the other, your own self-determination is meaningless. And that is why many Israelis, at the official level, at the personal level, and very much recently at the level of civil society, have been doing everything in their capacity to promote the realization, the actualization of this vision on the basis of the values that I've talked about. And I see some people here in this room, some Israeli colleagues and friends, who are at the forefront of this struggle. Every Israeli has to find a way of being decent with the other, because if we are not decent towards the other, we are not decent towards ourselves. And you know that. Now, that means that the best way to reach an understanding is through a negotiated settlement. And I think that preference has been enunciated by every person who has spoken up to now. But what's impeding a negotiated settlement is that almost all the parties to the conflict have lost faith in the possibility that it can be done. You know, I cannot remember a period where so many people have lost faith. My Palestinian friends have lost faith. Many of my Israeli compatriots have lost faith. And even in Washington, the skepticism is rising to the skies. Partly, by the way, motivated by fatigue. So many people are so sick of our conflict that they would just love us all to disappear, which will not happen. And I think more tellingly, it is motivated by real fear. Israelis are so strong, but they have a siege mentality that's very difficult to explain. The vulnerability is immense. And by the way, the Palestinians, most Palestinians I know, are afraid, justifiably. They've lived under occupation for 44 years, and that is abhorrent. What fear. And I said earlier today, and I will repeat again, probably one of the most important sentences. Fear and emotion are very bad guides to policy. And it's important for us to remember that. And in Israel also, and I am presenting an Israeli point of view, in Israel also, we are not capable yet of differentiating between legitimate criticism and dissent, which I think all friends owe each other, and between a small group of people who would really like Israel not to exist. There is no way that we have been able to distinguish between dissenters and delegitimizers, and that makes many Israelis really so worried. And we have to move from there. We must move from there. So, why is there a dynamic at work that is different than what we've known up to now? Partly because you cannot continue over and over and over again to live in a state which has no physical boundaries that are agreed on, where your future is uncertain from an Israeli perspective, but also, and this is why I think this is such a tremendous period, also because of three very fast-moving events around us. Number one, the Arab Spring. It is democratically driven. It is an opportunity. It changes the geostrategic structure of the region, even if the outcome won't always be democratic. But an important component of this is nonviolent action and an understanding that part of the opening of the Middle East today involves freeing Palestine. The second event was alluded to by Ambassador Wilcox, who is an old friend, and that is the Hamas-Fatah agreement. I can't say with veracity that the Hamas upholds the kind of liberal ideas that I adhere to. I always check political movements by how they treat women. It's a very good guide to many things. But having said that, it is a correct strategic move from a Palestinian perspective and a correct strategic move from an Israeli perspective. You cannot argue that there's nobody to make peace with because they only represent half of the Palestinian people. And then when they unite, say you can't talk to them because they have a bad history. But you want peace with your enemies. And the Palestinians have to deal with us Israelis. And we have some fanatics as well. And we have some very reasonable and decent people as well. Because I think the vast majority of Israelis and Palestinians are decent people. And that's where they want to go. And the third factor, of course, is September. And the September date has been on the agenda since August 2009, the Fayyad Plan, and it is a real date. It is the outcome of frustration that nothing is moving, and the desire to have a Palestinian state. It is real. As I said before, I think Israel should support a Palestinian state. I am not the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, and I want to tell you quite clearly that that will never happen. But having said that, if I were in a decision-making position, I would embrace this initiative. As many Israelis think. And so there are three interrelated external factors that all point in one direction. There are many opportunities here. There are immense dangers. There are uncertainties. It is a very highly emotional and emotive period, and it requires us to look at the options. I will draw out the options very quickly and suggest what we do about them. At the moment, I see 5 options, 5 scenarios. And I would like to suggest to you that you are all dealing with these scenarios, but it's my job to separate them out. The first scenario is that nothing moves. We're used to that, aren't we? By the way, I find that scenario totally unsupportable. That means that human agency has not been able to defy the stubbornness and the veto power of extremists. That is unacceptable. And it also means the continuation of occupation, which is inhumane, definitely for the occupied, but also for the occupier. It corrupts the occupier. But that's one option. Second option is the option of a negotiated settlement. The contours are very clear, based on the 1967 borders with swaps by agreement. Jerusalem as the capital of 2 states. Adequate security measures both for Israel and Palestine. Obviously, a just resolution of the refugee problem. I think everybody knows it. We don't have to belabor the point. We know what a negotiated settlement is going to look like. The barrage of words now and the nitpicking is taking out positions for negotiations. From that perspective, it is very positive. Very positive. Second option. Third option, creation of a Palestinian state or recognition of Palestinian independence by the UN General Assembly in September. Not an easy option because it separates between Palestinian statehood and the end of the occupation. There will be a Palestinian state, but the occupation will continue, and this is very problematic. But it does change the rules of the game in very intriguing and problematic ways, possibly, now you're eating, I love it, keep eating. Possibly, by the way, in such a way that it will increase violence, increase discrimination in the short term, and therefore one has to worry, not at the fact, but of the implications. A fourth option that we can see today is something that I like a lot. The Arab Peace Initiative in new form, a comprehensive solution, which now has an Israeli counterpart in the Israeli Peace Initiative as well. And by the way, today, it is not a bilateral issue, Israel-Palestine. One must regionalize the solution and internationalize the process. And the final option is that all the options that each one of us has conceived of, up to now. Continuation. Palestinian statehood in the UN. Negotiations. And the regional solution won't happen exactly as we think, and that there will be an abrupt end to the conflict in ways that we can't foresee now. Now, I'm going to propose to you something which will probably make me an unwanted speaker in many places. I happen to think that the solution, which will be fairly quick, will be a mixture of all of the above. Not just one or the other, but a mixture of all of the above. Recognition of a Palestinian state could lead to negotiations. There will be a continuation of occupation, and there may be a regional solution that come all together. Our job now is to entertain every possibility and to analyze it and to be prepared for it to happen. But there are three things that we must do. I'm so sick of words that I almost don't like to speak anymore. There's three things we must do when we're looking at these scenarios. The first is measure each unfolding occurrence on the basis of the values that must guide the outcome. If we do not go back to the values, we will not be doing anything. Please, I urge you, it must be just, it must be fair, it must be decent, it must be equal, it must be tolerant, and it must be respectful of the rights and the needs of both peoples. That's the first thing. The second thing, not unimportant, an understanding that civil society has immense force in this process. The decisions will be made by governments, but what will dictate the quality of the outcome is civil society activities and interrelations. You don't know how much power progressive civil society has today in Israel because it has no formal political power. I think that we don't need any more proof of the immense power of progressive civil society in the Arab world and in Palestine. But civil society means one must invest in civil society. Not, and I emphasize this, not exclude civil society in Israel or Israelis, because if you cut people off, you cannot engage them. and engagement is so important. I'm president of the New Israel Fund. We have founded 800 organizations in civil society, civil rights, human rights, social justice organizations. They are the key to a better Israel. And you need open avenues to them. They have to be supported, not indicted. And the third thing of what has to be done is engage and engage and engage. If one does not talk to the other, one does not understand the other, one cannot go. I am saying very clearly, I understand the need and sometimes the legitimacy of BDS. I think it is inappropriate and unhelpful at this stage because it weakens the forces of just change in the area and in Israel. And finally, if I may, just one emotion I think is valid today. Take the fear, leave it at home. Take the fatigue, drink coffee. But one thing, never give up on, that is the hope. Hope is absolutely essential because now is an opportunity that will not recur to resolve justly the Arab-Israel conflict in general and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in particular. And therefore, hope means every time you want to give up, keep trying. We don't have much time, but we will succeed with your help and with the help of all our friends. Thank you very much.
There is not one dramatic event, but many that are radically reshaping the political landscape of the Middle East. And in ways, excuse me, and in ways none of us had previously thought possible. There is simply no way to overstate the significance of what is taking place across the region today, from the transitions underway in Tunisia and Egypt following the historic removal of two long-time authoritarian rulers, to the ongoing and violent rebellions, or at least violent in terms of the response, in Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, Libya, and other countries. No country in the region, in fact, is immune or has been left untouched by the events of the so-called Arab Spring. Whether or not they have faced active rebellions, no country has been untouched. And yet the administration is largely going about the quote-unquote peace process, much as it did for the past decade or so. In fact, both the nature of the conflict and the regional landscape had changed dramatically even before President Mubarak or President Ben Ali were dislodged from power earlier this year. We already had, for example, an internal split between political and geographic division between Hamas in Gaza and the Fatah-dominated West Bank government of the Palestinian Authority. We had a dramatic rightward shift in Israeli politics. We saw the proliferation and increased sophistication of weapons used by non-state actors like Hamas and Hezbollah, which of course have also affected the process. The dramatic rise of Iran and its influence in the region has been another outcome, another major development that has affected this process. And yet, the United States and its international quartet partners continue to pursue negotiations as though Hamas and Gaza were somehow outside of the context of the so-called peace process, or as though Syria and its role with regard to supporting Hamas, Hezbollah, its relationship with Iran, somehow could be divorced from this thing called the peace process. I think the events of the Arab Spring have only deepened the sense that the U.S. is behind the curve. For all its talk of new beginnings 2 years ago, the Obama administration remains wedded to the largely outdated, failed, and ineffective policy formulas and mechanisms developed nearly a decade ago, and of course in a completely different environment. To draw a somewhat crude analogy from technology, it is something like trying to run your iPad apps on your old PC using Windows 95. And it's a very difficult thing to do, I can assure you. Bold promises, lack of follow-through, and pendulum-like shifts in policy have all contributed to this perception, even before the Arab Spring, that the administration's Middle East peace efforts were politically adrift. One example, the settlement freeze debacle that we all sort of watched this drama over the last year or two. In the course of just 8 months, the administration's position went from demanding a full and comprehensive settlement freeze in all of the occupied territories to a partial moratorium, eventually that was agreed to for 9 months, to where we are today, which is no freeze at all. All of that in the course of a span of 8 months. The low point, I think, for the administration, and I think one of the decisive moments as far as Palestinians were concerned in their decision-making, came last December when the U.S. was forced to abandon attempts to induce Israel to extend the partial settlement moratorium with a multi-billion-dollar incentives package. The ill-advised offer would have provided Israel with 20 F-35 fighter jets and unprecedented diplomatic and security guarantees in exchange for a 90-day extension of a partial, temporary, and ultimately ineffectual moratorium on settlement construction in the West Bank. The problem was not in Israel's rejection of the offer, but that it was ever made in the first place. That the administration was prepared to trade unprecedented and far-reaching strategic assets for short-term and highly questionable tactical benefits betrayed a degree of desperation on its part. More fundamentally, it highlighted the absence of a strategic vision guiding U.S. policy. In the absence of American leadership, as we've heard from our two previous speakers, the parties have resorted to their own quote-unquote unilateral solutions. Israel through its ever-expanding settlement enterprise and other facts on the ground, and Palestinians by soliciting international recognition of a largely imaginary state. 2.5 years into the administration, and with the region in total turmoil, the only new initiative the administration has put forth is to state officially that the border between Israel and Palestine should be based on the 1967 line with agreed swaps, which of course is the oldest new idea in the world. But let's look at it in a different way. In 1988, we're talking about now 23 years ago, the PLO recognized Israel on the 1967 borders and accepted the idea of a Palestinian state in 12% of what it considered its historic homeland, what the PLO generally refers to as the historic compromise. Both Israel and the United States at that time were still opposed to the idea of a Palestinian state. It was not until more than a decade later, in 2001, that President Bush made the creation of a Palestinian state an official part of U.S. policy. It then took another decade, in 2011, this year, for the U.S. to state publicly what everyone already knew, that 1967 would be the basis for negotiations. At such a glacial pace of progress, I think we can expect a Palestinian state somewhere in the next 30 to 40 years. And of course I'm being sarcastic, but that's just to highlight the snail's pace. Ambassador Wilcox talked about incrementalism, and I think what part of the problem is that we've been engaged in hyper-incrementalism. If you look at the nature, pace of the progress that has been made thus far. The reality, of course, is that there has been no peace process for the past 2.5 years. Only occasional, directionless, and, in my view, misguided attempts at launching one. Senator Mitchell's resignation just a few weeks ago is above all, I think, an affirmation of this fact. One of the fundamental contradictions, I think, in this administration's approach is that on the one hand, it has identified resolving the conflict as a vital national security interest. But I think one of the biggest problems is that you can't say that resolving this conflict is a vital national security interest and then somehow set it aside for whatever reason, domestic political reasons, bilateral relationship with Israel, and so forth. It's either a national security interest that is vital to the United States, or it's not. There are, I think, three fundamental paradoxes that need to be resolved before any credible process can emerge. Each of the three, of course, relating to the main actors in this process: the United States, Israel, and the Palestinians. For the United States, the paradox is that the U.S. is both the only party that can act and deliver a lasting agreement, and the only party that thus far hasn't been willing to act. For Israel, there's another paradox. Israelis feel no urgency to resolve the conflict when things are quiet, as they are now, had a period of relative calm. And at the same time, there's no will to resolve the conflict or take the risks in order to resolve the conflict when things are not quiet, as we saw 10 years ago in the midst of the Intifada. At that time, the refrain was, Israel won't negotiate under fire. And for the Palestinians, we have another paradox. As the party of negotiations, the PLO / the Fatah leadership of the PLO, only a Fatah-dominated Palestinian leadership can deliver a deal with Israel. At the same time, their willingness to engage in seemingly perpetual, and I would say self-perpetuating, negotiations with little to show for them has severely eroded their moral and political legitimacy in the eyes of many Palestinians. So Palestinians are confronted with this Hobson choice of either you engage in a process that ultimately kills your political standing vis-a-vis your people, and as we've seen, led eventually to a split within the Palestinian Authority, or you satisfy your international backers, and or you engage in a process where you attempt to meet the needs of your people, and of course then annoy your international donors and political supporters, namely the United States and the European Union, not to mention Israel. In my view, the time has come for a paradigm shift in how the U.S. goes about resolving this conflict, one that is capable of unlocking these three basic paradoxes, and above all, one that is commensurate with and reflective of the dramatic changes taking place in the region. And I think this will require primarily expanding the existing circle of involvement in this process beyond the United States to not just the other quartet members, but to include regional actors, and in particular, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, possibly Turkey, Qatar, and others. And I think related to this, beginning to take into account this new relevance of Arab public opinion, including Palestinian public opinion, in how this peace process has been pursued. I think for a long time, the process has been held up either because of American politics or Israeli politics, and Palestinians have been denied essentially politics throughout that period. And I think the Arab world also, being under largely authoritarian rulers, have been denied a measure of political participation. And I think now, in this new environment, this is the new variable that's been introduced is Arab public opinion, and it will matter, and it will shape the policies of those governments, and eventually our own. Only then, I think, will the parties calculate that they have more to gain by engaging with an American-led process than by acting outside of it. While merely articulating a strategic vision does not in itself guarantee the administration's efforts will succeed, I'm almost certain that the absence of one all but assures that they cannot. Thank you.
We have now time for some questions and answers. Unfortunately, Naomi Chazan has to leave to catch an airplane after a few minutes, so you might want to address the first few questions to her.
Naomi, can you tell us what is the general Israeli public opinion about the settlement?
Maybe we can ask one or two other questions and then answer them together, please.
Yes, thank you. I perked up my ears. First of all, I really applaud 95% of what you have to say. But I perked up my ears when you talk about the importance of civil society as part of the whole constellation of efforts, positive and needed. But then later on, I suppose I'm not exaggerating when you said you condemned the BDS movement. How do those two things square?
And a third question.
Our Jewish friends at APEC are meeting at this time, I believe, and I wondered if you would have any advice for them, or if we know if some of your heartfelt comments, which I take totally to heart, they were wonderful, are reverberating or would have some impact on the discussions of the American Jewish community that support Israel in that.
Thank you. So attitude towards settlements, BDS and civil society, and what to say to your friends in APEC.
I'll actually take them in order. And I love it when you said 95% because my ears perked up and I was saying, I know what the 5% is. Israeli positions on settlements. By the way, we poll in Israel all the time on these matters, and there is over 50%, and I think sometimes 60% that understand that settlements will have to go in a peace agreement. Many people are hoping that this will be in the context of a swap. But I really, when I heard Obama said 67 boundaries with swaps by agreement, I don't know, everybody's been saying that, including in the Israeli public for years. And I applaud the fact that he said it. I couldn't quite understand some of the reaction at home to that statement. I really couldn't. Look, many settlements were established in order to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. We know that. And in order to establish a Palestinian state, they are going to have to be evacuated and or dismantled. And most Israelis understand that. Okay, there's some who don't agree with that, but disagreements abound in many countries, and ours as well. I don't think that is going to be the issue. If there is a will to go ahead, every compromise will be possible. We have to remember that. What's lacking is not the direction of the solution. What has been lacking has been the political will to do so. The question on civil societies is really, for me, one of the most important things of democratic life. I go one step further, by the way. There are not democratic societies without robust and diverse civil societies. that they are the fundamental building block. Civil society is the fundamental building block of democratic societies. And I, by the way, have written several very boring books on the subject, which I do not recommend unless you need a sleeping pill. But having said that, when you want to strengthen civil society, when you want to make sure that its diversity and its resilience are in place, when you want to make sure that different opinions can be expressed, and much of progressive civil society in Israel today is under duress, then the solution is not to abandon. The solution is to engage. And it's very important for me to say that, and I will explain why, and I know it's controversial. I do not think BDS is a good idea in this instance. Boycotts and divestment and sanctions are a political tactic, and they are a legitimate, non-violent tool of democratic action. But they are put in place to achieve a certain purpose. And I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, that out of frustration that we've tried everything, which we have not, we do this on the assumption that it promotes the goal of creating a Palestinian state alongside Israel and ending the occupation. Now, I propose to you that's not correct. In this instance, it does a number of totally counterproductive things. Number one, it makes more Israelis believe that more people want to obliterate the state of Israel. It strengthens the right-wing position that we are under constant attack. It does in Israel weaken what's left of the left. And it weakens civil society in Israel, progressive civil society in Israel, because you won't talk to me. If you are doing BDS correctly, you are not talking to people like myself. It creates a diversion. Look, we don't have much time. Look at me. Somebody told me I look like a woman I know who's 10 years older than me. And I was a little crushed, but also elevated because it's a woman I respect very much. My entire adulthood, I have been advocating and promoting and doing everything possible, academically, politically, and on the civil society level, to realize a Palestinian state alongside Israel for the reasons that I told you about. I find myself now spending too much time being in discussions on whether BDS does that or doesn't. It doesn't promote that goal in Israel. What will promote that goal in Israel is support the progressive groups, the human rights groups and the civil rights group, and the Arab-Jewish coexistence groups that Archbishop Shakur talked about. Support the NIF. The Christian right in the United States backs the worst, most extremist elements in the in Israel. I would love the progressive Christian community in the United States to support the progressive elements in civil society. Because if we don't talk to each other, we're not going to resolve it. And that's why I strongly believe what I believe. And what would I do if I were invited to AIPAC, and what would I say? I think that's an easy one. You just heard it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have time for some more questions, please.
Yes, this is a question to all three panelists, and particularly to Naomi as an Israeli citizen. One of the recent phenomena that none of you mentioned, none of the three mentioned, is the sight of Palestinian refugees marching toward the borders of Israel and Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and their counterparts in the West Bank and Gaza and Israeli citizens, Arab citizens within Israel marching in solidarity with them. So the question is, what about the refugees?
Thank you. Another question, please?
Naomi, I was really with you as you're talking about the vision and the values that it should embrace and the universality of those values. And I stumbled, though, when you said that means we have to have two states. If the state is truly based on universal values, why cannot it be universally embraced by a Palestinian and Jewish society?
I will answer both of these questions, and I unfortunately race to the airport because I think we could be here all afternoon. And anyway, Khaled and Phil have so much to say. The refugee issue. The conflict will be resolved on account, in terms of the basic perceptions of both people. Not only if we figure out the borders in Jerusalem and all that, but if we understand and go back to the roots of the conflict. And if we understand and go back to the roots of the conflict, we have to understand that Israeli independence was achieved partly at the expense also of Palestinian self-determination and Palestinian rights. We have to go back to the roots of the conflict because I think the way to resolve the refugee issue is first and foremost for an Israeli leader to get up and to say, we share responsibility for the Palestinian refugee problem. Let's try and figure out how we go from there. And by sharing responsibility, and by the way, I think it goes both ways. I think there's certain Palestinian actions that somebody has to have the courage to say, this was wrong also, and let's move forward. But if you don't have this kind of frank conversation, it's really not going to happen. Okay? The one-state solution is awfully appealing to many people. It sounds so good on paper. Really. There are a few problems, little problems that I would just like to highlight, if I may, for a minute. The first is that there is a very strong, very justified Palestinian desire for collective self-determination, and it needs a response. Okay, just as there is a strong Jewish aspiration to entrench Israeli self-determination as well. Self-determination is individual and it is collective, and we have to respect that. So in the first instance, under any circumstances, that's necessary. Second reason is more important for me to convey. Look at me. Now I'm going to tell all before I depart. I was born in Jerusalem despite my fake American accent, and brought up in Jerusalem and still live in Jerusalem. I'm a Sabra. Okay? 2 years before 1948. My entire life has been a life of conflict with our neighbors. And Palestinians my age, and you heard Abu Nashakur last night, have a history, an entire life of enmity and acrimony with Israeli Jews. Every single one of us has suffered. And I never compare suffering. No, I don't know any Israeli of my generation that has not had somebody injured, killed, blown up. And I don't know any Palestinian who is not suffering on a daily basis from occupation. You don't sign on the dotted line and live happily ever after. That's going to take 2 generations. Our obligation today is to make the political agreement and settlement that will lay the basis for reconciliation. That is what we must do, and that will not happen by a one-state solution, only in the first instance by a 2-state solution. Let's do it already. Thank you.
Thank you all. We have time for a few more questions for Khaled and Philip. Please, I think.
Khaled, I live in Los Angeles, where Chazan is a well-known member of the Jewish community, and I know he's the patron of the Chazan Center at Brookings, which is a wonderful organization, and I've been meeting with him on adoption for many years. I just wonder, in the new environment that is being created, hopefully, via President Obama's speech at APAC and President Netanyahu here in the second summit, have you spoken with Hamas and do you think that he, if so, has he expressed his support for the 2-state solution?
Thank you. Has Mr. Chaim Saban, who's the patron of the Saban Center at the Brookings Institution, expressed support for the 2-state solution? Is that accurate? Yes, please.
Ambassador Wilcox mentioned one of the barriers to settlement of the conflict is the lack of parity between Israelis and Palestinians. In my mind, that's symbolized most by you have a state negotiating with a non-state. Big imbalance. And the state happens to be a military superpower. So my question is, how does one address that imbalance when pursuing negotiations?
Good. The imbalance and how do you negotiate with imbalance and asymmetry of power between the 2 sides? Yes, ma'am.
My concern with any of these solutions is, will Palestinians have water, respect, power, education, good roads, ability to travel uninhibited?
Fine. Unequal distribution of resources and land and dignity. Khaled, do you want to start? Yeah.
I think so. As far as the Saban Center and Mr. Saban goes, I don't actually talk to Mr. Saban. I don't know, frankly, what he believes or doesn't believe. My understanding is he is one of a number of patrons for the Saban Center. Apparently a significant portion contributed, in that the center bears his name, but I don't actually know the details of administratively or financially what that consists of. And I certainly don't know what his personal views are. I don't run ideas by him when I do things. It's not something that I think anyone at the Saban Center does. So I think that's a question that you might want to put to him directly if you have access to him, which I don't. As far as the asymmetry in power, I think this is a key question, and I think one that Palestinians are attempting to now deal with in this, by pursuing a UN resolution at the UN in essence, circumventing the so-called peace process altogether. I sort of think of it as a Palestinian declaration of independence from the peace process, which has obviously been very constraining and very harmful to many Palestinian interests, most notably its legitimacy of the Palestinian leadership and its cohesiveness. So I think this is one way really to President Obama has said that the PLO can't do an end run around Israel, and I think that misses the point. I think this is an end run around the process. I think this really has more to do with American management of this process than it does really ultimately even with the power imbalance. And I think what the Palestinians are trying to do is to redistribute the cost calculation in this process by sharing some of the costs so that they're not the only ones who pay. Obviously they're forced to be divided. They're already the weakest party. The nature of the Palestinian strategy, whether it's unity or it's pursuing a UN resolution, is to try and create a cost. It may be a limited one. It may be an ineffective one come September. But I think that's the calculation, and that is ultimately what's driving, I think, Palestinian thinking. And like Naomi said, that might, by sort of creating a slightly more, inserting some equilibrium in that process, that might itself generate a more productive negotiating process down the road.
Let me go back to the question of one state versus two states and the question of the refugees and the right of return. This conflict presents what I think is a moral paradox. Try for a moment to think about these two narratives, narratives which are based upon a high degree of reality. Palestinian people who did not participate in traditional anti-Semitism or mistreatment of the Jewish people were deprived of their homeland in 1948 by a people who came from Europe. 758,000, 800,000 of them were driven out either by force of arms or they fled in terror for their lives. A terrible, terrible injustice. It gives the Palestinian people huge equities. Think about this narrative. For 1,800 years, the Jewish people were treated by Christendom with contempt and loathing. They were never able to achieve the dignity, the humanity that they deserved in Western Christian society. The culmination of that, I realize that the Nazis were not Christians, but they did inherit an anti-Semitic tradition, which was, alas, deeply planted in Western culture and society. It was the Nazi era and the Holocaust that led to the creation of the State of Israel. It was not the longing to return to the ancient homeland of the Jews. There was no ready alternative for many of the remnant of European Jewish society in 1948. They couldn't go back to their homes. For years they had been denied a ready admission into Western nations and into the United States. They were a desperate people. Hold those two disparate concepts in your two hands. Must you choose between them? Here are two communities, two people who have suffered a tragic, tragic past. I think it's a mistake to try to choose between them as the foundation for peacemaking. I think you have to give due respect and compassion to both of these people and find a way out of what is a terrible mess. If you choose one side or another, I think you become part of the problem. If you are a real peacemaker, you will move beyond this kind of zero-sum moral concept and work out a way for both of them to survive and prosper. If you believe in one state, that is a very logical position, but I think it does not respect the equities of both peoples. Moreover, it will not ever enjoy the favor of the Western world. It would ensure almost certainly another 50 to 100 years of conflict. If you hold the creation of two states hostage to the right of Palestinian refugees and their heirs to return to the lands and homes that they lost in 48, you ensure failure of a two-state peace agreement. So I think that is a healthy way to look at it. It involves compromise. It involves a lack of certainty about the full moral dimensions of the conflict, which are probably beyond our capacity to resolve. As for the bargaining table, it is inevitably unequal. That is why third-party intervention is essential. I do not believe that intervention should or will take the form of an imposed peace on Israel or the Palestinians. I think what it will take is candor and truth and patience by the United States government and the international community speaking to both people, and in the hope that by providing a plan in all of its elements that will meet the essential interests of the Israelis and the Palestinians. For the Israelis, it means peace and security in their own state. For the Palestinians, it means the same thing, and the escape from the indignity of occupation, the injustice of dispossession. That's possible, to provide that hope for both sides. That's the only way we can do it, and we haven't begun to try.
Thank you, Phil. David.
Yeah, the model for success in the Arab Spring so far has not been to wait for Obama or to ask the authoritarians to step down. It's been to get out in the street. I'm just wondering if you talked about the Palestinian nonviolent movement, and if there's any prospect of that becoming more widespread in a nonviolent way.
Thank you. The efficacy of the Palestinian nonviolent movement? Yes, please.
We've heard a lot of talk about the Arab Spring. I'm wondering if with what you see here and what's going on over at the convention center with the move over to AIPAC and the other things that are bubbling up within American civil society, is there any sense of an American spring?
On the Palestinian nonviolent movement, I think you guys have a workshop later on today on that very subject. But I will say one thing, and this relates back also to the question on refugees. We saw, I think I think it's important to keep in mind that the Arab Spring, such as it is, I mean, obviously, I think Arab Spring is a bit too optimistic given the difficulties in many of these countries. I mean, this phenomenon of the Arab Spring, I think, is not just aimed at or manifested as the overthrow of dictators. I think it's basically and fundamentally about mass popular mobilization and the sense of empowerment. And I think this is where I think another area where the administration I think is a little bit behind the curve. We saw not too long ago, was it a week ago, or a little bit more during the Nakba commemorations, we saw the first manifestation of the Arab Spring in the Palestinian diaspora. I think we saw already effects inside the occupied Palestinian territory. Most notably, the move towards national unity, which had been a main popular demand, and of course the balance of power had shifted in a way that eventually enabled that. But we haven't heard from the refugee communities, particularly in Lebanon and in Syria for a long time. And I think that's a sign of the fact that this peace process, whatever that means, has generally neglected them. And I think we saw another indication of that in Obama's speech on Thursday, this compartmentalizing, another form of incrementalism, this, in my view, sort of failed Oslo approach that you can disaggregate the process and say we're going to deal with borders and security first, and then we'll carve out Jerusalem and refugees for some later time. And of course, that's really just trying to institutionalize what has always been the reality of the peace process, and that is the marginalization of the refugees and the refugee issue. And so here was this dramatic event that combined the nonviolence of the Arab Spring and the sense of empowerment with this historical neglect of the issue. And they came knocking on Israel's door and saying, here we are, we're not going away. This is, and I think this is a very important manifestation. And it wouldn't surprise me to see other manifestations inside the Palestinian territories directed eventually probably at settlements, at the closures. We might see various forms of civil disobedience. I think it's a question of not whether the Arab Spring has arrived in Palestine. I think there's a lot of commentary on that, and I think a lot of it is misguided. But the Arab Spring in some ways really began in Palestine in 1987. I mean, this was really the first essentially nonviolent uprising by people in the region against a military dictatorship, which is, in this case, in the form of the occupation. So I think, you know, it's sort of ironic that it's now come full circle and hasn't fully penetrated Palestinian society or Palestinian thinking, but I think it's probably inevitable that it will get there at some point.
You are part of the American Spring. It's not here yet, but you are, and many other groups, Christian, Arab American, and Jewish American, are part of a vocal, maybe still a majority, but it's part of a larger minority, but it's part of a larger silent majority. If you look at public opinion polls in this country, repeated polls, including polls within the Jewish community, there is a very strong urge by the American people to resolve this problem in the interest of protecting the United States of America and out of a sense of moral justice and goodwill toward both of the protagonists. We talk about the dysfunctionality of Israeli and Palestinian politics as an obstacle to peace. We need to acknowledge that our own politics are also dysfunctional. Now, I would like to think that the President and his advisors are the keenest and most accurate analysts and judges of where the American center lies on this issue. Yet they implicitly are deferring to the extremists. And that means there's something wrong here. It means that to correct this dysfunction in our own politics, all of us, activists in civil society, have to enlarge our voices and tell the administration the truth. And that is that the majority of Americans want peace. I think they want two states. They want justice, and they want, above all, protection of our vital national security interests.
Thank you, Phil. Are there other questions, please? Please.
I'm just wondering if it's possibly partly a need to redefine what it means to be a friend of Israel, and if it's a need to redefine what brings security, because it's nonviolence that is spoken in these other areas. But I'm not sure whether nonviolence is what comes forth from American policy and American speakers. Yeah.
Okay. Are there other questions? You want to address the issue of I'm not sure I understand exactly where you're driving.
I had a tendency to say, you know, friends don't let friends drive. So friends of Israel don't let Israel.
So in a sense, the U.S. is enabling
Yes.
Israel in the occupation and the other problems.
And is there a way to redefine that?
Can you address the U.S. as an enabler?
I think we need to, that's absolutely true. We are an enabler. We have, for decades now, by and large, deferred to Israeli policy, even though we didn't like it. Some presidents have broken through. Dwight Eisenhower did when he told David Ben-Gurion that Israel had to get out of the Sinai, where it had colluded with the British and the French in 1956. Jimmy Carter did it when, against many of his advisors' advice, he had the courage and the dogged perseverance to pull Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat together and make peace between Israel and its greatest Arab enemy. George H.W. Bush and Jim Baker got a very good start at this, but they ran out of time. It was too late. So yes, it can be done. We need to fight strenuously this notion that criticism of Israel of Israeli policy is criticism of Israel. We have to distinguish between those two, because that canard has been exploited brilliantly by Israelis who do not recognize that their country is in mortal danger. You're right about security. Israel's security depends absolutely on making peace with the Palestinians. Otherwise, they will lose what is becoming now even more tenuous, their goal of being a Jewish and democratic state. And while our leaders, and I notice President Obama and others repeated it this weekend, this insistence that we are going to guarantee Israel's security. We can't guarantee Israel's security. They are undermining it themselves. And if we succumb to the idea that we are the ultimate security guarantor of Israel and emphasize security above all in our relationship, it's a big mistake. The more we have lavished arms and money on the state of Israel, and I know this because I've worked on this issue for many years, we would say we're doing this to give the Israelis the confidence to take risks for peace. Alas, it's had the opposite effect. It has given them the confidence to continue what they're doing and given them no doubt about the American embrace. I think the American embrace ought to be used more properly. As I said, to convert it into a two-way street and to start speaking the truth to the Israelis. They are living under an illusion, and we have helped to perpetuate that illusion. And as you say, that is not an act of friendship.
Bill, thank you very much. Khaled, thank you very much.